I'm so happy to welcome Katherine Maher from the Wikimedia Foundation to Bloomberg and to this event.
I'm so happy to be here.
And I'm so looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Me too.
Wikipedia and Wikimedia, Wikidata have been foundational to so much of AI and increasingly influential in media as well, I think. So why don't we start by telling us a little bit about the scope of Wikimedia? What are the things that it does? What's your favorite part?
My favorite part of Wikimedia. So I think Wikimedia has been around for 18 years now. And is anyone in the audience not used Wikipedia in the last month? You can always ask. But I think that should give you a sense of sort of how pervasive it is. I think many people here are familiar with Wikimedia, but what most folks don't realize is it is actually the 5th most popular website on the planet. It exists in 300 languages. We have about more than 1.5 billion unique devices come to our sites every single month, which is pretty remarkable if you think about the fact we're not selling anything. All we're doing is providing knowledge for people, and not just any sort of knowledge, but actual knowledge that is oriented around learning. So Wikipedia today has 50 million articles across those 300 languages, the largest of which is English Wikipedia with about 5.5 million articles. To give you context, I think people spend about 60,000 years a month reading Wikipedia, just in terms of overall consumption, which is pretty nuts. That's about 17 billion page views every single month. And that's just the sort of surface of the pond. Wikimedia is also much deeper than that. We have Wikidata, which is our linked and open structured data project, which also has 50 million items in it. Wikimedia Commons, which coincidentally has 50 million rich media and other sort of files and images. And that is just the beginning of this ecosystem that we support, which is all around how do you make knowledge available for free. And we're continuing to look at how do you expand and grow that out in more sort of inclusive definitions of what knowledge actually is.
My favorite part of the whole of Wikimedia is a picture of a brassica with a beautiful tessellation. I know I'm a nerd, but it's this gorgeous picture.
I was actually going to say, so Wikidata, one of my favorite parts about it is Q1, which is the first item in Wikidata, is the universe. Q2 is Earth. Q3 is life. And Q4 is death. Q60 is New York, as our Wikimedians of New York have made a beautiful button that says I heart Q60. And Q42 is Douglas Adams.
Oh, great. That's great. What is the 5-year plan or long-term vision for the Wikimedia Foundation?
The Wikimedia Foundation's been around for 15 years now, and we just went through a whole project to look at what do the next 15 years look like. So instead of 5 years, I'll tell you 15.
Great.
Yeah. So right now today, I think most people know us as a consumer web project, which is a huge part of who we are and how we interact with people, and it's still going to be, hopefully in 15 years, the people will know Wikipedia as the primary way that they interface and access freely available information, neutral, high-quality information. But what we're really interested in is how do we expand that out beyond just being a website, because websites are going to be a portion of the way that we interface with knowledge, to also thinking about how do we build a free knowledge graph that is much more inclusive of than the knowledge that just exists on Wikimedia, but actually can network institutions that are invested in knowledge, whether that's academic institutions, archival institutions, research institutions, through a linked open data infrastructure. We're interested in building out the current open source software systems that we run to be sort of a federated knowledge platform that people can build knowledge tools upon. Thinking about how our open infrastructure, which we already run today, can support other knowledge institutions. And then thinking about how we build service layers, APIs on top of all of this so that other people can continue to reuse and think about new ways of innovating and engaging with this sort of knowledge. So that's my hope, is really going from what does Wikipedia as a website look like, that surface of the pond, to really thinking about how do we surface that whole ecosystem in a way that elevates free knowledge as a whole, letting us bring the public that we have, that 1.5 billion people, to all the other knowledge institutions and missions, and letting those sort of institutions bring their missions to that public.
That sounds like a great vision. I mean, with AI, with deep learning these days, people assume that representation is meaningless if it's not vector-based, but so much is based on getting to the atoms and the relationships that are in Wikipedia and other knowledge graphs.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is one of the things, I keep referring to the surface of the pond metaphor because there's so much that's invisible about the way that Wikipedia has been used and sort of the Wikimedia ecosystem as a whole to actually train and inform the way that all sorts of products that you use day to day represent the world. The fact that Wikipedia has become such a primary driver of of NLP researcher, for example, and the way that we think about sort of structured ontologies in almost every single product that is used in a consumer-facing function really impacts the way that we have understanding and sort of the way that representation matters, particularly when you start to look at the biases that are inherent in Wikipedia as a whole and what they mirror in terms of sort of structural societal biases. And so a big part of our feeling is that we want to be really transparent and intentional about the way that we build this out, because we're worried that, you can edit Wikipedia, but you can't always edit the way that Wikipedia is then used to go on and sort of the biases, the way that those propagate into other parts of the digital ecosystem.
That's very true. Speaking of bias, how does Wikipedia encourage diversity and objectivity in the editorial and authorial workflows?
I think the first thing that we do is start by acknowledging there's a heck of a lot of bias. There's a lot of bias in Wikipedia. There's bias in the people who edit Wikipedia. There's bias inherent in each one of us as an individual, but also structurally in terms of the demographics of folks that edit Wikipedia. And then the Wikimedia Foundation, what we're really interested in is how do we actually build the tools and resources to engage in that conversation, whether those are technical tools or whether those are community-based tools, in order to be able to say, how do we welcome more people in? How do we support institutions or individuals who are looking to address these structural biases? How do we audit for these structural biases? And this is where machine learning has been really helpful to us. Our scoring platform team is very interested in how we can evaluate these questions across Wikimedia's content as it exists today. And then how do we sort of actively audit ourselves for our performance in these issues and then redirect resources accordingly?
So there's a project that I know of where computer scientists will write Wikipedia pages about female computer scientists. And then sometimes some controversy arises, I guess, amongst the editors about whether this person is Wikipedia worthy. Yes. How does that sort of thing work out? Is there a notion of getting consensus? Is there a voting mechanism?
Yeah, this is one of my greatest frustrations, I'll be really honest. Because the Wikimedia Foundation, what we can do is we can illustrate and we can nudge and we can build tools, but we actually we have a strict line between what Wikimedia Foundation does on the editorial side versus what the community does. The community sets editorial processes and engages in those sort of individual reviews. What we're looking to do is how can we actually provide community members with heuristics to be able to evaluate sort of where an article or any individual article might sit within the spectrum of the whole ecosystem. And then how do you use that to be able to make better judgments around whether an article is, or a subject of an article is noteworthy, whether an article could use more citations, whether it's high quality enough to remain. How does this sit in terms of sort of the lens of a subject area, whether it's an article about a female computer scientist or an African female poet, both of subjects which are sadly missing in terms of the robustness that they should have on Wikipedia, in order to engage the community, because our community members tend to, I think one thing that's really notable is there are only about 250,000 people who edit Wikipedia on a given month. And of those, only about 75,000 to 80,000 edit Wikipedia more than 5 times a month. And of those, only about 40,000 of those people work on English Wikipedia. So now all of the decisions that are being made day in and day out, and Wikipedia is edited 350 times a minute. So all of those decisions are actually going through a relatively small number of eyeballs. And so how do we give those relatively small number of eyeballs better tools to make more effective decisions quickly, while also seeking to expand the pool and the diversity of editors? Because we do very much believe that you can't have the sum of all the world's knowledge unless you have a representation of all of the world's different lived experiences.
That's such a great point. With AI, increasingly the kinds of bias that worry me aren't that someone has the information wrong or slanted, but it just isn't there.
Yeah.
How do you work to get more coverage of events and information in other parts of the world?
Oh, that's interesting. So I was actually going to use a slightly different, do you mind if I back into this to a slightly different example? This isn't something that we're doing currently, but I think it shows the potential that AI has to offer. There's a project called Quicksilver that is run by a company, it's called Primer, which works in AI, that actually took a look. They trained their model on existing articles about scientists on Wikipedia, and then they fed a database of 20,000 articles that have been published in peer-reviewed journals into their training set, and then mapped who on Wikipedia of those 20,000 matched the distribution of existing Wikipedia articles. So existing Wikipedia articles looking at what sorts of citations they had and then who in this 20,000 article set had a similar sort of distribution but wasn't in Wikipedia. And I think that's a really interesting sort of model that you can start to look at, is like, where are things missing? And then even within existing Wikipedia articles, so they found about 40,000 people who probably should have articles. And then they found about 30,000 people who do have articles whose articles weren't high quality enough. And so I think that that's the sort of modeling that you could actually do around the world globally to be able to say, what can we do from a representation standpoint? Now, that only works, and this is where I think being in the conversation on machines and media is really exciting, because that only works if there's coverage that is being generated of topics. And this is where we often at Wikipedia end up sort of on the front edge of this, where people will come to us and say, we're very disappointed because this is not in Wikipedia. And we'll say, well, we're very disappointed because this has not been covered historically by reliable sources that would allow us to write the articles about it. So I am very much a proponent of, as folks who are in the media go about your work, what are the models that you're using to do accountability on who is represented, who is quoted, who is covered, because that actually informs the tertiary source that Wikipedia can actually build based on those secondary sources.
Is the Wikimedia Foundation interested in going a step beyond finding the information, the missing information, to actually semi-automatically authoring articles, or
as a matter of fact, we are.
Yes,
I think we are very interested in this, and lest that sound like it's a really foundational sort of jump from where we've been in the past. I was talking to some editors the other day who pointed out that the very first use of machine learning on Wikipedia, or AI on Wikipedia, was actually in 2002, just a year after we got started, when someone wrote a bot that filled in 32,000 articles on English Wikipedia just based on census data. So if you think about the way Wikipedia has been built over the years, we've always been using machine augmentation to continue to improve what we call the project. First, by building out articles where there were none, then thinking about how do you manage vandalism at scale. Wikipedia vandalism spikes between the hours of around 8 in the morning to about 3 in the afternoon, which, if any of you have children, tracks really well with when kids are in school. And that vandalism, we can actually identify and model that vandalism, and then we have bots that go through and sort of clean it up and go across the projects, clean it back up. A little bit like painting the Golden Gate Bridge, start at one end, I'll go all the way across. And so there's always been work that we've been doing around how do you augment the human functions that are repetitive and are predictable in such a way that allow us to engage people in sort of higher level operational functions. So we're looking at content augmentation, both as natural language generation, which we think has a lot of possibilities, particularly where the language models are richer. So unfortunately, that tends to benefit languages that are quite robust and well resourced. But then also, what can we do around content translation and automated translation that is less about translation in bulk, but more about article syncing, so that you're able to integrate varied and diverse perspectives across languages. Because if I'm a speaker of Bahasa and I'm a speaker of Igbo and I'm a speaker of English, I'm going to have different perspectives on a series of issues, and we'd much rather see those integrated perspectives than make the assumption that one perspective is the right perspective. So that's, I think, very much the future of where we see content expansion, because we recognize that there's just this enormous paucity of resources and information for so many speakers in the world, and there's such a tremendous deficit. As a learner, if you are learning in a language that is not your native language, that is not spoken at home, you lose 50% of the material that you learn every single time you walk into a classroom. So if I'm not a native English speaker, but I'm learning in a English language curricula, I am already set up with all these structural barriers to comprehension. So we're very interested in how do we address that through really engaging in sort of supporting the growth of other languages well above and beyond what already exists today.
That's so cool. I'm an NLP researcher. My field these days just lives off shared tasks. If Wikimedia Foundation wanted to come and say, here's a shared task, you'd get a whole pile of free labor.
Well, it's amazing. Actually, most of the things that we know about how Wikipedia works is through partnerships with researchers outside of Wikipedia. And I think that is the advantage of having a totally open project. And so one of the things that we bang on about in public is the field can only advance, and particularly in the sort of consumer product space, if we are transparent and accountable about what it is that we're doing. And so for us, when we think about the ethics of how do you build in any sort of augmentation, what we're really thinking about is how are we transparent about what our intention actually is? How do we think about auditing for bias? How do we actually have closed loop systems rather than open loop systems so we have the ability to assess and reintegrate? And then how are we accountable to change when we see those problems? And so the reason we've been able to learn and grow well and beyond the scale of the 350 people who actually work at the Wikimedia Foundation is because we have had the advantage of working in this open community of researchers and engineers and contributors, of course, that have made it possible to do something at almost an impossible scale.
So coming back to repainting the Golden Gate Bridge, some Wikipedia articles are quite controversial, and the time at which they become controversial may vary. And then you get a pile-on of edits and re-edits. And how does the software even cope with that? How do the software help the editors to figure out what the right version of the page should be right now? How to reflect the different stances in the edits?
Absolutely. So it's a techno-social problem. The first thing on the software side, every single edit that's made to Wikipedia is tracked in what we call our recent changes feed. And we have our scoring platform team, which is our ML team, has built that out in such a way that we can indicate, we think this is a high quality edit in what we call good faith. So this is a person who's trying to improve the edit, to improve Wikipedia, and it's a good edit. This is a low quality edit, but it's in good faith. So maybe this just needs a little bit of help. This is a low quality edit, and this is in bad faith, which is someone trying to what we call vandalize the encyclopedia. And so that allows that sort of triage, given the sort of volume of edits, is the first thing that editors can look at, and it's sort of an event stream that they can actually use to say, okay, I need to work on this, or there's edits happening over here, which might indicate a breaking news event, or perhaps a celebrity has died, or perhaps a new movie has just come out. The Avengers, I think that was a really big one. That draws a lot of attention. And so that's really, the first sort of step on any given point. Then when it gets into sort of more controversial or slower moving conversations, the software really sort of fades into the background other than being a permanent repository of those conversations. So every single edit, almost all the way to the beginning of Wikipedia, we lost some data because we kept going down in the early days, is existent on Wikimedia today. You can go back to the original version of the article all the way back to like 2001, which is also one of the reasons Wikipedia is such a valuable training resource in general. And the way that Wikipedia editors will do this is they'll use what we call those diffs, those different edit versions, to be able to get into very specific conversations about sentence structure, about composition, about citations, and then they have the ability to lock an article and sort of essentially say, hey, look, we're going to stop conversation on this until cooler heads can prevail. And that's really where the social component comes in, where there's advanced social structures that allow somebody to come in from outside a heated debate and say, you know what, we're just going to slow all of this down and wait till we get to a simmer, and then we can restart this conversation, and no changes will be made public until we can get to that point. So the software on the back end helps people evaluate where the hotspots are, and then it really comes into these social structures of self-regulation and very strong content policies that are embedded in the values of the community that allow for people to have those difficult conversations. And sometimes they can be a little intractable. I mean, sometimes those conversations will just get stuck in a place for a long period of time. Now, that can be a good thing if we're dealing with information that is not well cited or this sort of fringe theory information, but it can also be a bad thing, particularly when we're dealing with issues of bias, because historically marginalized and minority communities often do not find themselves represented, or newer thinking or evolutions in thinking on those topic areas have to then run the gauntlet of the weight of history, and that's often very disadvantageous.
I was really inspired by this op-ed you wrote in March in the Times, and what stuck with me was this phrase, the right to inquiry is universal. And given your own international background, which I want to ask you about in a couple minutes, I was curious how the Wikimedia Foundation is encouraging access for everybody, like the 2.5 billion people who you said in the article have mobile devices but don't yet have internet access, who could be enabled to pursue this inquiry.
Yeah, so the origins of where we come from and come to in our work come from a very rooted in this set of values that the right to inquiry is universal, that the right to inquiry can only happen with sufficient privacy. People can't know what it is that you want to learn if you are going to truly be able to have that intellectual freedom, that the right to freedom of expression is foundational, and that all of us should have the right to information in order to be able to self-govern ourselves and live in the societies that we wish to live in. And that really, I think, underscores what we're trying to do at Wikipedia is not build an encyclopedia, but it's to give people the information and the knowledge, to give people a platform to build the knowledge, not give people the knowledge, but to participate in building the knowledge that they need in order to live the kind of lives that we hope people can live in the best possible way. So for us, there are a number of different things that we do. We actually just, and this is not quite your question, but we actually just launched a lawsuit today against the government of Turkey in the European Court of Human Rights, because Wikipedia has been blocked in Turkey for the past 2 years, denying people, the 80 million people, the access to Wikipedia in that country. So we will take very strong policy and litigation actions when necessary in order to defend that right to inquiry. Similarly, we focus very much on on some of these technical privacy aspects. We use HSTS to encrypt all of the Wikimedia websites in order to prevent the ability for individuals to for governments and other ISPs and other entities to man-in-the-middle attack and be able to see what it is that people are learning. And then for folks who are offline, we support a variety of projects around providing access to Wikipedia. So we have a project called Kiwix, which is an offline version of Wikipedia that is distributed through a variety of different networks around the globe. It's this incredibly lightweight. I think last time I looked, it was less than 20 gigs because Wikipedia is mostly text-based content that can go into a Raspberry Pi style internet-in-a-box device that can go out and create a hotspot that people can use globally. And then what we've been experimenting with is, can you actually do asynchronous editing so we could actually send those out and see what comes back? Because we very much believe that sort of innovation comes from the margins, and some of the best ideas are always going to come from the edge cases. And so that's a big project of ours at the moment.
That is very cool. Yeah. How does your international background inform your work at Wikimedia?
So I think what Amanda's referring to is I had the fortune of growing up about 45 minutes outside the city in Connecticut. And then when I was 18 years old, I moved to Cairo, Egypt, and spent quite a bit of time living overseas in the Middle East and in Europe, and then working for UNICEF and other organizations, primarily in sub-Saharan and in Eastern Africa and some other interesting places around the globe. And I think, and the focus of that work was always, how do you marry inexpensive, emergent network technologies with goals around human development, access to education, access to health, access to civic participation. And I think the thing that it has informed me of is that whatever solution you design here in New York is never going to work. The solutions have to be co-designed with folks, and literally co-designed with folks in the places and in the communities that you have to design for the problems, co-design for the problem set, co-design for the solution set, rapid test and field iteration. When I say field, I could mean like an office in Lagos, right? Like just anywhere that is not in New York City or in San Francisco. And then I think a real sense of solidarity and empathy, because everywhere you go in the world, people are really trying to get through the day. They're trying to seek opportunity. They're trying to provide opportunity for their families. Most folks, they wake up in the morning, they're looking for their cup of coffee. They're looking for a way to make it through the day in a way that creates marginal improvement in their lives and the lives of the community around them. And if you ground it in that basis and all of the work in that basis, you don't start by trying to change the world. You start by trying to partner with people to achieve what goals that they have for their communities, families, and societies. And that's a very different basis to start with.
Yeah. One of the tragedies of computing, I think, has been that for so long, the choices of things to work on, as well as the methods, have been made by a very small group of people who are very privileged. And it's this phenomenal thing now to see things like deep learning courses being run in sub-Saharan Africa and people really moving out, because it will inform and change the kinds of problems that the whole field works on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've really made an intentional effort, and just in our recruiting practices at Wikimedia Foundation, to recognize that if we want to serve the world, we can't we have to look like the world, right? And so going out and starting and really looking at how do you do recruiting from a variety of different non-traditional sources. When I worked at UNICEF, one of my favorite projects was we needed programmers in Zambia, and it was really hard to find anyone who knew Python there. So we went to the mathematics department and said, hey, you guys are really good with abstract reasoning. Would you want to learn how to code? And we did a pair programming project, and now all of those programs at UNICEF are run by local Zambian engineers, and they've totally taken, run and developed those products themselves. So like it's completely possible, and people who don't think it's possible are just, there's a paucity of imagination.
So I mentioned this to you in an email before, but there are 35,400, I checked today, papers in Google Scholar that mention Wikipedia plus NLP.
Wow.
That's a lot. The field would be, in fact, the mere existence of multilingual NLP largely depends on Wikipedia and the data that was made available by contributors there, and the platform and the edits, actually also. So it's really foundational to AI in general. How can AI give back to the Wikimedia Foundation? How does AI influence, and how does it threaten the work that the foundation does?
Yeah, I think that AI, I've spoken a lot about the upsides around it: content generation, community governance, the ability to do not just language translation, but language integration. I think that the ability to model what information exists in the world, well, not exists in the world, model what information has been deemed to be notable and what is missing. So there's tremendous upside. I think on the downside, what we worry about is what I think of as the exploitation of the commons. And so a lot of what you've said, what you just described, is a tremendous amount of research, of sort of developments in research that have come out of working off of this open data set. That has often been commensurate with is a closing of the internet, or a closing of consumer products, a closing of the open web, a closing of open standards, a move away from open source, things along those lines, and a move away from accountability and transparency. Our concern is both that is, antithetical to the values that we believe in, but we also believe that if the commons is exploited in such a way that is the direction that the interfaces and products go, there will be no regeneration of the commons in the future. And it is not, from my perspective, acceptable to say, well, English Wikipedia has 5.5 million articles, and so that's cool, we've done it for the richest and most privileged people on the planet. The commons has to be rich, global, diverse, and representative. Otherwise, we are building for some and we are not building for all. And we believe that every single person on the planet has something to share and something that we can learn from with all of the variety of their lived experiences. And so what we would want back from people who are utilizing and training off of our products is support the commons. You don't have to do it yourself. That's what we exist for in a direct way. We are going to be the ones who are out there supporting this crazy, global, sprawling, chaotic, cacophonous community. That's okay. That's what we love. That's what we're here for. But we need resources and support and a commitment to openness if we're going to do that. It doesn't have to be monetary. It can just be a commitment to open standards. It can be a commitment to publishing your research. It can be a commitment to investing in open source libraries and tools. Support the commons, because if you close off the lifeblood of the commons is an exploited resource, and it needs to be a renewable one.
We're surrounded here today by people who are in media as well. So what would you like to say to the people from the media, journalists who are here, who are using Wikipedia, contributing?
I'd like to say that I think we're all part of a knowledge ecosystem, and we rise and fall together. That means that, as I said earlier, secondary sources need to really be thoughtful in terms of who we're covering, why we're covering those topics. Wikipedia does not just is not missing representation of women alone. It's also missing representation of rural communities. It's missing representation of indigenous communities. It's missing representation of so many things that are not well-resourced and well-covered. And so we need your partnership and we need your support in that. I would also say that we're deeply invested in the integrity of the industry of the free press, as well as research, academic research, sort of longer form, slower form, secondary knowledge generation, so nonfiction work and the like, because of the fact that we can't build a house on a rotten foundation. You know, Wikipedia doesn't work if there is not trust and credibility and fidelity in the knowledge ecosystem as a whole. And so we want to be a partner in that, because very often we're the first place people come in order to learn about a topic, or we are the contextual reference that people use when something is happening in the world. I mentioned the sort of media, the pop culture parts of what happens, but I can tell you on the day that the Mueller report dropped, that was like topic number one on Wikipedia. People use Wikipedia to understand what's going on around the world and to understand and make decisions in their lives. You can see this with every election, not just presidential elections in the United States, but globally, how people seek information, deeper context on not just candidates, but electoral processes, history, and the like. And so we need to, like, I think that there's a symbiotic partnership that exists within our ecosystem. We think of us as maybe little p public media, not big P public media. And think about how we might be able to partner, because we know that we're already driving traffic to a lot of your sites, and the topics that you cover drives traffic to ours. And I think that's a really regenerative ecosystem as opposed to an exploitative one. So that would be my...
Is there an example of a collaboration with a media organization that has been really productive on both sides?
Not yet, which is an opportunity, I think. You know, we've talked about, I think the big, what we really wanted to do is get into, like, how can we get into your archives? But there have been some licensing issues there. But I think that I would be really interested in thinking about what, if anybody wants to come up to me afterwards, what could we explore? Because I think there's a rich opportunities out there.
Absolutely. What are the biggest ethical issues facing the Wikimedia Foundation?
How do you walk the line in the most highly capitalized and competitive sectors to have ever existed? We, you know, being the fifth largest website in an environment today that is as challenging, competitive, and oftentimes cutthroat as has ever been the case, how do we stand for our values and do so in a way that is authentic and true and is in the interests of people, while also being able to simply operate in an ecosystem in which policymakers view us as, you know, just a potentially just having a similar operating model to all the other really big companies, but also potentially just a casualty of whatever sort of the regulatory or legislative concerns of the day actually are. So I think that the ethical concerns for us are always, how do we stay true to our values? How do we stay true to our communities? How do we stay true to the public interest mission of what we do, while working in an environment that's changing all the time and is really difficult? This doesn't sound different from the media, does it? It sounds pretty similar.
Yeah. And perhaps if you could just take a minute and tell us how the Wikimedia Foundation is funded.
Absolutely. The Wikimedia Foundation is and has been funded primarily through small dollar donations throughout our entire history. So about 85% of our funding comes from 7 million people who donate an average of $15 a year. So that last year was just over $80 million. We every year at the end of the year or throughout the year, we run campaigns. You'll see us asking for the cost of a cup of coffee. Wikipedia will keep going. And so 7 million people is actually not a huge number of the many, many hundreds of millions who visit us. But it is a huge number in terms of what we think of as a community of free knowledge supporters. And we really like the model that allows us to be written by people in the public interest for other people, and then supported by people, and then I'd actually add owned by people too, because all of the content is open license. It literally does not belong to the Wikimedia Foundation.
And when I think about what it must cost just even to keep you in servers.
Well, I mean, it's largely text-based, so it isn't as expensive as you think, but we are unusual in that we run our own server infrastructure. We're not on the consumer cloud. And part of the reason we've chosen to do that is because we want to be able to maintain our integrity in terms of not being subject to political pressure, in terms of hosting content that might be politically disfavorable variety of places around the world, and because we want to be able to maintain the privacy of our users and have complete control over the way that their data is tracked and how it is stored. So we're a little odd in that sense. We still roll our own DNS, which is really unusual.
Wow. Yeah. One question just for Justin. Oh, one question just for Justin, and then I'll open it to the audience. I'll open it to the audience in just a second, I promise. In terms of augmented reality and like video and these things that are bigger than text that might be coming into Wikimedia Commons have to be indexed, you have to be able to find them. What is the Wikimedia Foundation doing about that?
So the first thing that we are doing is we're working on a integration of Wikidata with our media hosting. So it's called our Structured Data on Commons project. And the whole idea is how do you actually have better structured data around these media files, metadata, what was actually represented in them, so that they're more usable. Because Wikimedia Commons was never meant to be what it is today, which is currently the largest repository of freely licensed educational content on the planet. So we're working on, we've got some, what do we call it? We have a just-in-time architecture, and we're working on making it more robust and resilient. And then I think the next step for us is we have the ability to host things like 3D files and the like. I think we're very interested in how do you do that, and how do you host rich content in a way that has fidelity to the values of Wikimedia. So if we're hosting video content, how do you make sure that content can actually be edited and updated and refreshed and sort of collaboratively generated? And then how do you make sure that when we do that, it adheres to the editorial policies that Wikipedia is committed to? Because as we know, video content, particularly indiscriminate video content and algorithmically driven video content that is sort of indiscriminately uploaded is certainly a really big challenge in terms of content and disinformation today.
Sounds fascinating. Okay, so I will open it. Ulrika, you were the first one.
I would like to go back to what you said, how AI can be useful for cleaning up the comments, like weeding out this is bad faith and this is just poorly written but unintentionally. But I'm wondering whether that is just cleaning up after the fact, and if it wouldn't be more productive to get to the root cause of the problem, because with these so-called edit wars, often it seems like, for example, what was in the news, that women scientists need a lot more citations and a lot more qualifications to be recognized worthy of having a Wikipedia article. And that is probably because lots of women don't want to edit Wikipedia, because it can be a very toxic place in certain subsections for women. So instead of having AI clean up, what could be done to diminish that problem, that root problem in the first place?
Yeah, so there's almost three pieces to what you just said. And I should be clear, AI doesn't clean up. AI helps identify hotspots for editors to then engage with. The first is we actually sometimes maybe I shouldn't say this. Sometimes vandalism is the first way that a person learns they can edit Wikipedia. And some of our longest and most faithful editors perhaps first started by vandalizing Wikipedia. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing always that a 13-year-old goes in and writes a dirty word, because then they realize they can actually have an impact on the way that something is seen by the world. And that's kind of exciting. There are very few platforms in which people can create in the world in a meaningful way today. The second thing I think that you highlighted is really around the unequal standards for the way that content is evaluated. And so that is one of the things that we're very interested in, how you model, so that we can actually provide editors with sort of the tools to say, look, this article is well cited relative to other articles in, for example, evolutionary biology, or articles about evolutionary biologists. And we have a real-world example of this. There's a woman who goes by the username Kaylana, who is a medical student, who every time somebody trolled her on the internet for a gender-related reason, she went and wrote an article about a female scientist. And she knocked it out of the park. And when we went back and modeled those articles, every single one was of a higher quality standard than the median article about a male scientist. And so now we actually have a model of an average article, which is about a man, and a exceptional article, which is about a woman. And so these are the sorts of models that we can actually provide to our community to be able to say, here's what a well-structured article that will endure on the site looks like. Here's what the sort of citations that you might want to seek, to actually give people more guardrails so that when they start building an article, that's an article that will meet the standards, sort of be an unimpeachable article. And that's, I think, where the opportunity lies. And then there was a third thing, but I apologize, it's gone out of my brain.
Yeah, it was all related.
It was all related, okay.
Where's the microphone?
Hi. One of the questions is in your evaluation where you do like the quality and good faith kind of metric, have you looked at doing recursive models of the sources of these edits that work on the same principle as Google PageRank, where you're looking at what's pointing into a website, but not just at one level, you're looking at what's pointing into that one. And so it's a rate the raters and weight the ratings kind of a process that builds trust.
Yeah, there's a project called, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're speaking of, but there's a project called WikiCite, which is meant to look at the structured citation graph of all Wikipedia articles. And we've been, the folks who work on that are on our research team and have done some of that in partnership with other research institutions. They're very interested in how that can be fed into our understanding of the quality of the article set, but also informing our understandings of where influential research actually comes from in terms of informing public understanding of any particular concept. I know that's not exactly what
But
you're...
I'm also talking about the editors.
The editors themselves?
You know, are they reliable editors or are they trash editors? And you could direct your moderation
we do
based on that.
So we don't track individual editors for privacy reasons, but instead, we look at the edits themselves rather than the individual editors. It is the case that if you're a highly active editor, which means that you make more than 100 edits a month, we probably know you by name, and probably everybody else in the community does too, which is part of the socio-technical component. We were talking about this in the green room earlier. There is a very social component to what happens on Wikipedia. And what's interesting is it's a very intrinsic reward system as opposed to an extrinsic reward system, which makes it very different than other social sort of network functions. There's an essay on Wikipedia that says this isn't a social network, but we all know that's not actually true. Like, it is very much a social-driven activity in which reward and sort of recognition are part of how people do their work.
But potentially AI could help you do that even better.
Yes, although I don't think our community would like being modeled. I think they would resist it pretty aggressively. It's a good question, though.
We have a question here.
This is a little bit more about the biases within the editing. So I've been editing for 3 years, and I understand about you're building up trust of how many edits you do, and you get to higher levels with and then there's certain levels you
progressive
get to,
responsibility,
and then you have more power, or. But I've noticed that sometimes some of the editors will be kind of rude with when they decide. I've had some I've made pages for executives and they go through or whatever, and then there's other ones where they one time a company, I sourced it with TechCrunch, Forbes articles, all these things, and they'll just right away go, oh, this was a boring private company, blah blah blah, and then they just kind of in a rude way, and I spent 10 hours putting 40 citations in or whatever. Or one other question is, when somebody maybe tries to write about something and the first time it gets flagged and brought down. So this big media company called The Next Web, that apparently had happened to them in 2015, and I went and was oh, this is a real media company. They get millions of views,
sure,
whatever. They should be worthy enough to be in there. And I went and got 40 citations of other news organizations about them. It went to this immediate flag system because it had been whatever, and they just automatically didn't, there was no ifs, ands, or let's talk about this. They just denied it within, 6 hours of being up. And I'm this is a real company. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I think it is a real company.
I think it's worthy enough. It gets
so
millions of traffic.
The issue that's probably at work there's probably a couple issues at work there, and some of those are defensible and some of them are not. One of which is probably the second most controversial thing on Wikipedia after biographies of women, and I'm just acknowledging that, is people afraid that Wikipedia is going to be used like the white pages, if you remember what the white pages were. That it would be an indiscriminate listing and companies do try all the time to get their articles in to Wikipedia or try to be listed in Wikipedia. And so their editors have a reflexive response oftentimes to anything that's about a corporate entity with a for-profit conflict of interest potentiality. So there could have been that going on. The other thing that I will say is you're giving an example of the auto-flagging, which is the sort of machine augmentation. I think that is something that worked very well at a certain point in our history, and it's something that we are having a conversation with our community about how maybe we could change some of the way that works in the language and the processes, because I can tell you the first time I wrote an article, it was patrolled. And I felt as though the cops had just cruised my house and accused me of like breaking the law. And I was like, and it turns out patrolling just means like, oh, this, we checked on this new article and someone's checked on it and someone's had eyes on it. But what a horrible language. Like, and so I think that's the sort of thing that we are looking at. I got blocked the other day editing on my mobile because they blocked an IP range because of vandalism. Mm-hmm. And the message that I got was so disempowering because it was written by a community member and it didn't tell me how to fix anything. Mm-hmm. So this is the tension, I think, at times with this beautiful project that's been written by all these people, and it's like this symbol of human generosity, and then sometimes you're like, well, someone's having a bad day.
Or even learning the system is almost like learning to code. Like there's so many rules inside of like all, And
this is a longer term structural problem that our community and contributions team is trying to figure out. How do you make smaller, what we're calling neighborhoods that can welcome somebody into a subject matter that they're interested in and provide them with a supportive community? Because what we found is much like some of the research that talks about why women don't participate in technology, is that when people are invited in to a system, when they see other people doing the work of the system, when they're mentored in the system, and when they have explicit understanding of why their work matters, they are more likely to stick around. And I think some of the advantages of how we've been built as this sort of very open platform, but that openness has also not necessarily kept pace with increased understanding of what allows for digital participation in safe ways for folks who are not sort of the majority community.
Your question may also come back to something you said towards the beginning about Wikimedia planning over the next 15 years to move, I'm going to use the word federated, which probably isn't what you intend, but move towards a more multiple different kinds of contributors and partnerships, because Bloomberg is sure interested in privately held companies, let me just tell you. So we would be happy to have and write knowledge about that might be shared with selected people or with the community at large. We're out of time. I found the Wikimedia, I find your mission to be very inspiring. Everyone should donate, I can say that. And thank you so much for talking with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for the great questions.